They thought they could humiliate her and walk away. But when the judge entered the room, their smirks vanished, and so did their sense of control. It starts like any other day. Two white cops arrest an elderly black woman over a minor issue. To them, she's just another target, another powerless victim they can push around. They bring her to court, confident this is a slam dunk. But what they don't know is that the judge presiding over the case has a personal connection they could never expect. This isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about confronting deep-seated prejudice. What happens in that courtroom not only changes their lives, but exposes a harsh truth about power and privilege. Keep watching, because this story isn't just surprising, it's unforgettable. Two white police officers arrested an elderly black woman for something trivial. To the cops, this was just another easy day, a chance to flex their authority on someone they viewed as insignificant. But to the woman, it was yet another humiliating reminder of how the system fails people like her. The officer's attitude told the entire story. Smug smirks, dismissive tones, and an overwhelming sense of superiority painted a clear picture. They weren't just enforcing the law, they were using it as a weapon. To them, this woman's dignity and humanity didn't matter. She was just another number, another person they believed they could dominate without consequence. As they handcuffed her and pushed her into the patrol car, their language wasn't just harsh, it was degrading. Their words carried layers of disdain, the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of unchecked prejudice. The woman didn't fight back, she knew better than to argue with men like them. She'd seen this story unfold too many times. Compliance was her survival strategy, but even in silence, her eyes spoke volumes. She wasn't just angry, she was exhausted. The journey to the courthouse wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It represented the long, painful road that marginalized people have traveled in a world where power dynamics are often stacked against them. Sitting in the back seat of that patrol car, she thought of her son, the pride of her life, who had fought so hard to break through these barriers. Little did the officers know, the son they dismissed as irrelevant would soon become the centerpiece of their own reckoning. In their eyes, this arrest was routine. They believed their power ended at the courthouse door, where a judge would rubber stamp their actions without question. But what they didn't realize was that their own biases had blinded them to the bigger picture. The courtroom wasn't just another stop in their day, it was the start of their downfall. The real challenge here wasn't just the woman's struggle, it was the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. These officers were products of an environment that normalized their behavior. They weren't afraid of consequences because, in their experience, there were none. They believed they could act with impunity because they'd been taught that people like this woman didn't matter. That mindset wasn't born in a vacuum. It was cultivated by years of systemic inequality and unchallenged authority. For the woman, the challenges extended beyond this single moment. It wasn't just about the arrest, it was about everything leading up to it. It was about living in a world where her worth was constantly questioned and her voice was ignored. It was about the countless microaggressions, slights, and outright injustices she had faced over the years. This arrest was just another chapter in a lifetime of struggles, a stark reminder that even her age couldn't protect her from the ugliness of racism. For the officers, the challenge wasn't just about facing the consequences of their actions, it was about confronting their own prejudices. They didn't see themselves as villains. In their minds, they were just doing their job. But that's the danger of implicit bias. It allows people to justify their actions without ever questioning the harm they caused. These officers weren't just up against a judge, they were up against their own deeply ingrained beliefs about race, power, and authority. As the courtroom door loomed closer, so did the inevitable clash of perspectives. The woman, weary but determined, was ready to face whatever came next. The officers, cocky and overconfident, had no idea their lives were about to change. The problem wasn't just the injustice of the moment, It was the centuries of systemic inequality that led to this confrontation. And in that courtroom, the stage was set for a reckoning that neither the woman nor the officers could have anticipated. The challenges in this story run deep, exposing the cracks in a system built on unequal foundations. The arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. What lay beneath was a tangled web of prejudice, privilege, and power dynamics that were about to come crashing down. The moment the courtroom door opened, the energy shifted. The two officers, feeling untouchable, strolled in with a sense of dominance, completely unaware of the shock awaiting them. To them, this was just another routine case, a minor issue involving an old black woman who, in their eyes, was powerless to fight back. They had no idea they were walking into a reckoning they would never forget. The woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her posture both weary and composed. She had seen the worst of the system and knew better than to expect fairness. Yet there was something in her gaze, a quiet confidence that hinted she understood more than the officers realized. What they saw as submission was something entirely different. The calm of someone who knew justice was closer than it seemed. When the judge entered the room, it was as if time stopped. The officers' expressions changed immediately, from smugness to disbelief. They exchanged glances, their confidence starting to waver. The man standing at the bench wasn't just another figure in a black robe. He was young, black, and carried himself with an air of authority that demanded respect. But what truly unsettled them wasn't his presence. It was the way his eyes lingered on the woman sitting in silence. There was a familiarity in his gaze, a connection they hadn't anticipated. The courtroom fell silent as the judge addressed the room. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had worked hard to reach his position. The woman's son, a man who had fought against odds to rise within a system not built for people like him, was now the one deciding the officer's fate. And they were starting to understand just how much power he held in that moment. The judge began to read through the case details, his tone measured and professional. But beneath the surface, an undeniable tension filled the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance replaced by a creeping sense of unease. They weren't used to this dynamic, being at the mercy of someone they'd been taught to dismiss and disrespect. For the first time, the power imbalance wasn't in their favor, and they didn't know how to handle it. As the hearing unfolded, the judge's focus became sharper. He didn't just question the facts of the case, he dug deeper, peeling back the layers of bias and injustice. His questions were pointed and direct, forcing the officers to confront their own actions. Why had they escalated a minor incident? Why was excessive force necessary for an elderly woman? Their answers, filled with half-truths and justifications, only served to expose their ignorance further. The courtroom atmosphere became heavier as the judge shared his own perspective. Without losing his professionalism, he made it clear that this wasn't just about the law, it was about accountability. He spoke about the responsibility that came with wearing a badge, reminding the officers that power wasn't a license for cruelty. His words weren't just a reprimand, they were a reflection of a lifetime spent fighting against the very attitudes they embodied. Meanwhile, the woman watched quietly, her expression unreadable. She had seen her son rise through a world determined to hold him back, and now she was witnessing him use his position to challenge the very system that had wronged her. It was a bittersweet moment, a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, began to realize the gravity of the situation. This wasn't going to be a quick dismissal. The judge wasn't just holding them accountable for their actions, he was forcing them to confront their own prejudice. Every question, every statement was a mirror, reflecting back their ignorance and arrogance. It wasn't just about the outcome of the case, it was about the lesson they were being taught in real time. As the session progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. The judge didn't raise his voice or show anger, but his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just speaking to the officers. He was addressing the entire system that allowed their behavior to go unchecked. It wasn't just about this one case. It was about every instance of injustice that had been swept under the rug. The exploration of their actions didn't stop at the surface. The judge questioned their training, their decision-making, and the biases that shaped their approach. He pointed out the flaws in their justifications, exposing the ways they had dehumanized the woman they arrested. Every response they gave only deepened their discomfort, as it became increasingly clear that they couldn't hide behind their authority. By the time the hearing neared its end, the officers' demeanor had completely shifted. Their earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of shame and uncertainty. They had walked into the courtroom expecting to assert their power, but they were leaving with a new understanding of its limits. The judge's words stayed with them, echoing long after the session ended, a reminder that their actions had consequences, not just for themselves, but for the system they represented. The woman, still sitting quietly, finally allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had ever been dismissed, mistreated, or silenced. In that courtroom, the power dynamics had shifted, and justice had found its voice. The courtroom air was thick with tension. Every word the judge spoke carried the weight of years of experience, injustice, and an unwavering sense of purpose. The officers stood before him, visibly squirming under the pressure. Their earlier confidence had crumbled into uneasy silence. They weren't used to being on the receiving end of scrutiny, and now their every move, every word, was being dissected. The turning point came when the judge directly addressed the officers, locking eyes with each of them in turn. His calm but piercing gaze seemed to strip away every layer of their defense. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, forcing them to confront the reality of their actions. The room was silent as the officers fumbled for words. "We were just doing our job," one finally muttered, his voice lacking the certainty it carried earlier. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanging. "Doing your job? Tell me, what part of your training justifies humiliating and dehumanizing an elderly woman over a minor infraction?" The officer stammered, unable to provide a clear answer. The judge didn't let up. "When you put those handcuffs on her, did you stop to consider her as a person? As someone with dignity, someone who deserves respect?" His words cut deep, not just for the officers, but for everyone in the room. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about the countless others like it, where power had been abused and humanity ignored. The woman sat quietly, her eyes fixed on her son. For years, she had endured the quiet, relentless grind of systemic racism. She had fought to shield her children from it, to teach them resilience and strength. And now, here he was, using the very system that had tried to hold them back to fight for justice. Her pride was evident, but so was the weight of everything they had endured to reach this moment. As the judge continued, his tone shifted slightly. It wasn't just about reprimanding the officers. It was about making them see the deeper implications of their actions. "Do you know who this woman is?" he asked, gesturing toward his mother. The officers looked at each other, unsure how to respond. "She's a retired school teacher. She's spent decades educating children, children who grew up to contribute to the very society you're supposed to protect. She's a mother, a grandmother, a pillar of her community. And yet, to you, she was just someone to push around." The weight of his words hung in the air, unrelenting. The officers, stripped of their usual bravado, stood silently, their expressions betraying a mix of shame and defensiveness. The judge continued, "The badge you wear isn't a license to degrade or dehumanize. It's a responsibility you've clearly forgotten." Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge paused, took a deep breath, and looked directly at his mother. This is personal for me, not because you arrested my mother, but because of what it represents. It represents a failure of empathy, of justice, and of humanity. His voice faltered slightly, but he quickly regained composure. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't just about my family. It's about every family that's been disrespected, dismissed, and disregarded because of the color of their skin. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint shuffle of papers. The officers' faces had gone pale. The judge's words weren't just a reprimand. They were a call to accountability, a mirror forcing them to confront their own biases and actions. It was the kind of reckoning they had never anticipated. But the climax wasn't just about the officers' discomfort. It was about the shift in power, the undeniable sense that justice was being served in a way they hadn't expected. The judge's measured tone, his refusal to lash out in anger, made his words hit even harder. He wasn't just speaking as a son or as a judge, he was speaking as someone who understood the deep, systemic pain this moment represented. And then, in a voice that was both steady and unyielding, the judge delivered the final blow. You don't get to walk away from this without understanding the damage you've caused, not just to my mother, but to the trust that people are supposed to have in you. This isn't about punishment. It's about making sure this never happens again. The officers, unable to meet his gaze, looked down at the floor. Their silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the arrogance they had carried into the courtroom. For the first time, they seemed to understand the gravity of their actions, or at least the consequences they now faced. The woman, still silent, allowed herself a single deep breath. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but in that moment, it felt like a small victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been in her shoes. The courtroom had become a battleground for justice, and for once, the right side was winning. The courtroom fell silent as the judge finished speaking. His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The officers, once so confident, now stood humbled, their expressions a mix of shame and unease. For them, this wasn't just a loss in a legal case. It was a moment of reckoning, a crack in the shield of privilege they had long taken for granted. The elderly woman, seated calmly, finally allowed a faint smile to cross her face. Her son had not only defended her dignity, but also reminded everyone in that room of what justice truly means. This wasn't just about her. It was about every silent victim of prejudice who never got their day in court. As the session ended, the officers walked out, no longer the same. The judge's words, sharp yet fair, had planted seeds of reflection that could not be ignored. Whether or not they changed was up to them, but the system they represented was now exposed for its flaws. Subscribe for more stories that spark change. Please note this is not a real story, it's a work of fiction only for educational and entertainment purposes.